Habla con esto.
Si quiere pasar la ronda del
¿Quieres hacer la presentación? De arriba. La idea es lo que pasa es que la fotografía será de se supone que sí. Y eso es como un se le da la vuelta a la imagen y eso le pasará el
me voy a conectar yo también, por si acaso.
Esto lo que pasa es que se quedan verdes. Manu, no te vayas muy lejos porque esto se enciende. Y le hemos dejado activado para que se quede encendido, pero no.
Esta mañana lo he cerrado y se quedaba así, en verde.
Ahora, por ejemplo, le doy el verde y se queda. Se apaga.
Dale aquí otra vez, a ver si está bien.
Yo te veo bien. Ah, o sea,
Eso que dije que eso es que está.
Buenas tardes. Vamos a empezar la sesión de plenaria de por la tarde, la segunda sesión. Y antes de empezar me ha pedido de la organización que advirtiera a José Ángel Ortuño, Ricardo Dacein y Pedro César Dutra que por favor en el descanso busquen a Luis Buendía para un tema de organización. Y vamos a empezar esta sesión. Tenemos como ponente esta tarde invitado a Philipp Heimberger, que es un economista post-keynesiano muy conocido en los temas de economía o política económica aplicada en la Unión Europea. Es economista del Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies y allí está dirigiendo un grupo precisamente de investigación en macroeconomía y es doctor por la Vienna University of Business and Economics, y básicamente sus líneas principales de investigación tienen que ver con la economía política de la Unión Europea y los aspectos macroeconómicos de las políticas económicas europeas. Escribe regularmente una columna en un periódico alemán, el Handelsblatt, y también contribuye muy frecuentemente con otro tipo de columnas en periódicos extranjeros y también es muy activo en Twitter. Thank you very much, Philipp. His speech is about the meta-analysis and the application for macroeconomic policy prescriptions. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Volker. First of all, many thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm honored to be here, and I'm also aware that it's after lunch, so maybe the most difficult time of the day. I'm trying to make it as exciting as possible. So today in the morning, Tom Pelley had a presentation where he was mainly concerned about theory and the link between economics and politics. And I think what I am trying to say today is rather complementary, because what I'm concerned with here is the empirical foundations of macroeconomic policy prescriptions. But I guess that we kind of also share similar experiences in this regard. So right, when we participate in economic policy debates, then we are often confronted with rather self-confident claims by mainstream macroeconomists concerning the macro impacts of their policy prescriptions. What I want to do today is basically introduce you to the toolbox of meta-analysis, which, as I will argue, is very useful when it comes to critically assessing the empirical foundations of these macro policy prescriptions. I mean, I'm in a room with lots of critical economists, so I don't have to tell you much about this, but one important perspective when it comes to understanding the evolution of modern macroeconomics is to view it as a battlefield of competing schools of thought. Okay, so you have the Marxists, the institutionalists, you have the Keynesians, the new Keynesians, the post-Keynesians, whatever, and they have different views on the workings and the efficiency and the macro effects of fiscal policy, monetary policy, labor market policy. But what's important to understand, obviously, is that at a particular point in time, a specific paradigm is typically dominant. Yeah? And what has been dominant over the last couple of years and decades is what has been called the new neoclassical synthesis, or in policy terms, the Berlin-Washington consensus, which arguably consists of three main pillars. The first is that fiscal policy, but also monetary policy, should be rather tight because of the supposed low effectiveness of expansionary policies and their inflationary tendency. The second pillar is the deregulation of financial markets, but also of trade and labor markets, because of the supposed structural inefficiencies of extensive policy interventions. And the third pillar is arguably this notion that actually a specific policy mix and institutional arrangements contributed to this great moderation before the global financial crisis, inflation targeting central banks, constraints on fiscal policy. However, that also kind of pushes under the carpet subdued growth and labor market performances in several countries, but also other phenomena such as rising inequality, trade imbalances, and private debt accumulation. But I think what we often see in economic policy debates is that when it comes to kind of providing supportive evidence for the synthesis or the macro policy prescriptions derived from it, then quite often you see cherry picking of individual studies which allegedly support these policy prescriptions. What I want to do today is ask the question to what extent this toolbox of meta-analysis can be useful in analyzing the empirical foundations in a more systematic way. So one naive approach to saying how can we settle theoretical and policy debates would be to argue, well, just look at the data, just apply econometric tools to the data, and then we can settle these debates. Why is that naive, or why does that not work? Well, I already told you that when an economic paradigm predominates, that also means that its methods and confirming results are much more likely to be published in academic journals, and in particular in the most prestigious journals. And even for well-meaning researchers who want to make a career, there are clear incentives, there is pressure to produce significant and theory-conformist results. And I mean, everyone in the room who has done econometric work and knows that there are lots of degrees of freedom when you do empirical research, right? So you have to make specific choices, which data to use, how to transform the data, which control variables to include in your empirical model, which variables to exclude, which econometric approach to take, etc. And these degrees of freedom also provide opportunities when it comes to actually searching for specifications, which in the end produce significant and theory-conformist results. So what I want to do today is introduce you to methods that allow you to test whether something like selective reporting might actually exist in the body of empirical literature. And what I will do is basically critically challenge three mainstream macro policy prescriptions. The first is that government should push for fiscal consolidation to bring down high public debt to GDP ratios, as high public debt is allegedly a drag on economic growth. I guess many in the room are already thinking about the Reinhardt and Rogoff paper. Then the second is that fiscal policy is rather ineffective in stabilizing the economy because fiscal multipliers are typically smaller than 1. And the third prescription that I want to tackle is that government should liberalize labor markets to ensure competitiveness and avoid unemployment. And what I want to show to you today is that when you actually apply meta-analysis, you find that the empirical foundations of these macro policy prescriptions are shaky and unsound and lead you to different conclusions. So let me give you a brief introduction to meta-analysis. Some of you might be familiar with it, but I guess not all of you. So the core idea of meta-analysis is that one specific estimate on the effect of a specific policy intervention on macroeconomic outcomes cannot be decisive, cannot be the last word, because it might actually be affected by selective reporting and other biases. And therefore, what you should do according to meta-analysis is collect all the relevant estimates on a relationship that you're interested in, then use them each as one piece of information and fit that into a larger statistical picture, and use that statistical picture to draw statistical inferences and economic interpretations. So meta-analysis is basically a tool for providing a quantitative synthesis for a body of literature. So you collect all the available empirical evidence. I will say more about this in a minute. And then you apply parametric and non-parametric weighting schemes to detect whether there is selective reporting of results and to approximate the underlying average effect size, the weighted underlying average effect size, which is then kind of the best available estimate that you have based on the empirical literature out there. And that kind of avoids this fallacy of potentially cherry-picking results that might not be reliable. Meta-analysis often allows you to question conventional wisdom. I will talk a lot about publication bias today. So as you will see, many bodies of literature that are relevant for macroeconomics are actually publication bias is relevant there. And applying meta-analysis also quite often allows you to uncover unexpected determining factors. So why do the results reported in different studies actually differ? Meta-analysis has something to say about this. Okay, how is meta-analysis being done before I move to the applied part? So what is the practice of conducting a meta-analysis? First of all, obviously, you need to choose a research question with a quantifiable parameter. I will talk about several of these quantifiable parameters in a minute, but let's say you're interested in the employment effects of minimum wages. Okay, so you would collect estimates on this from the literature, and importantly, you would then need to make these estimates comparable across studies. Quite often they are not. So there are different ways of standardizing these effect sizes to make them comparable. Then you use a search strategy with keyword searches. So typically what you do is you go to Google Scholar, you go to Econlit, you go to other databases, and you use keyword searches to come up with a list of papers that is potentially relevant for the question that you want to tackle. That typically gives you hundreds, if not thousands of papers. And then the task for someone conducting a meta-analysis is to actually come up with predefined criteria for including or excluding papers that you want to consider for your meta-analysis. So typically what you do is you can only include papers that report regression coefficients with the precision of these estimates, that have certain quality criteria when it comes to reporting the results, because that is relevant so that you can standardize the effects and then make them comparable. And so what you do is, based on the list of papers that you have a list of criteria, and then you check whether the papers actually fit these criteria or whether they don't. You read the papers that are relevant for the meta-analysis. You get familiar with the literature and its important dimensions. What data do researchers use? Where do data sources differ? What methods do they use? Where do the methods differ? What other characteristics might be relevant in explaining why they report different results or why they agree on certain findings. You then start the process of collecting all the information based on the primary literature. So you collect the estimates, you collect the standard errors, you collect additional information on data and study design, publication characteristics, etc. You build a meta-analysis data set, which typically consists of at least a couple hundreds of observations. In some cases, that can also be a couple thousands of observations. So that's the time-consuming part of doing a meta-analysis. After coming up with this data set, you double-check for errors and inconsistencies, and then you perform the meta-analysis. And that's where I will now come in with my explanations on what tests actually exist on publication bias, but also meta-regression analysis, where you try to uncover determining factors of reported results in the literature. So this is a picture of an anonymous researcher who is very sad because he just ran his regression models and actually he is not able to come up with statistically significant results. Obviously, this means that his publication probabilities have gone down quite a bit. This is a picture of an anonymous researcher who has just found that after running his regression models, all his main results turn out to be statistically significant, which is obviously great news. Okay, jokes aside, what are we talking about here? We are talking about the phenomenon of selective reporting of research results, which is a serious issue which can very much be a problem for statistical inference and economic interpretation of empirical evidence. It's basically about the incentive, both of the authors of papers, but also of the editors in journals, to kind of have a preference for statistically significant results that conform to a specific theoretical explanation. So it has also been called the file drawer problem. So that kind of some research results are pushed into the file drawer, they are not being published because they are either not statistically significant or the direction of the effect doesn't conform to theory. Now, how can we test for this, whether this actually exists in a specific body of empirical literature? There we can use or exploit econometric theory. The core idea is pretty simple. It is that if there were no selective reporting of results, if there were no publication bias, then you would expect the effects that are reported by primary studies to be essentially unrelated to the precision of these estimates. So you would expect basically the effect sizes to be systematically unrelated to the standard errors. In other words, if you look at this graphically, this is a so-called funnel plot, which is used by meta-analysts to visually detect potential publication bias. If there were no publication bias, econometric theory tells us that actually the distribution of the results should build an inverted funnel. That's why it's called the funnel plot. So basically, the distribution of the results should be symmetric, should build a symmetric funnel where the more precise estimates, so you have more precise estimates up here and less precise estimates on the vertical axis at the bottom. And these less precise estimates should also be distributed rather symmetrically. Here you see a synthetic example of a funnel plot which is not symmetric. So what you can see is that the more precise estimates are at the top and rather close to the zero effect line, but you have more imprecise estimates on the right, which would indicate a positive effect size, whereas there seems to be missing studies or missing estimates here on the left. I will show you now several of these funnel plots to make you more familiar with this, because visual inspection is often a first clue about whether there could be publication bias. Let me first of all show you a symmetric funnel plot, where there is likely no publication bias. That's from a paper of mine which I published 2 years ago in the World Economy. It's a meta-analysis on how economic globalization affects income inequality. I collected about 1,200 estimates on the relationship between economic globalization and income inequality. And here you see the distribution of these results. So you can see that several studies on the left to the vertical zero effect line, they actually report an inequality decreasing impact of globalization. But you have many more observations on the right indicating inequality increasing effect of globalization. And the more precise estimates, which are at the top, they're also in positive territory, indicating a small to moderate positive or inequality increasing impact of globalization. But what you can see that's important here, the imprecise estimates, and many of them are due to simply random sampling error, they are distributed rather symmetrically. And that's also what I find in the paper. There is actually an inequality increasing impact of economic globalization, in particular financial globalization, but there is no evidence for strong selective reporting in this particular body of literature. Let me now show you another funnel plot, which actually hints at strong publication bias. It's a rather famous one, which was also a little bit influential in policy debates. It's on the employment effects of minimum wages. So you have on the horizontal axis the elasticity comparable across studies, and you have on the vertical axis again the precision of these estimates. Okay, so again a funnel plot. But when you look at this now, you see on the left of the vertical zero effect line, at the bottom with the less precise estimates, you see many more observations or many more reported estimates than on the right. You kind of have a large chunk of missing estimates. Econometric theory will tell you that if there were no publication bias, if there were no asymmetry in the funnel plot, there would need to be more estimates there. What you can also see is that the most precise estimates are actually rather close to zero, which is the vertical solid line. So in this paper, the authors, Tukuliaros and Stanley, they argue that this is rather plausible, what they find, because there are strong incentives for both authors, but also editors, to selectively publish results which conform to new classical labor market theory, which tells you that the employment effects of minimum wages are negative. However, what I have shown you so far is just visual inspection of the distribution of the results, giving you some hints about whether there might be publication selection. I will now show you the major approach in terms of how to test formally, econometrically, for publication selectivity. And the idea is, as I sketched out before, which is to regress the standardized effect sizes on their precision, on the standard errors. Because as I already said, you would expect that if there were if the final plot were symmetric, and therefore likely there is no publication bias, then you would expect the effect sizes and the standard errors to be essentially unrelated. If we can reject the hypothesis that the beta-1 parameter here is 0, then that would be evidence in favor of an asymmetric final plot, which would be indicative of selective reporting of results. And we could then also interpret the direction of the publication bias and correct for it. Before I show you some results with regard to the so-called funnel asymmetry test, let me just quickly mention that obviously there are also other methods for testing for publication bias, which have been developed over recent years. So for example, there is a paper by Andrews and Casey where they propose a method to estimate conditional publication probabilities for conventional critical limits of p-values. So this is a method that, for example, allows you to estimate that it's five times more likely to publish negative employment effects of minimum wages than it is to publish 0 or positive employment effects of higher minimum wages. There are also other methods. I will not go into them for the sake of time, but I just wanted to mention that this is an important field of research in meta-analysis. And typically what you do is you use different methods for detecting publication bias, and then in the best of all cases, the results are consistent across these different tests, which makes you then more confident that there is actually publication bias or not. Let me now show you results on this funnel asymmetry test by talking about one of my papers, which is on the question whether higher public debt levels reduce economic growth. Let us apply some meta-analytical tools to this question. Why is that important? Well, I'm sure you're all aware this was a big policy debate, in particular in Europe, during the Euro crisis. So this is a quotation from Olli Rehn, who back in 2013 was the EU Commissioner for Economic Affairs, and who said that, well, public debt in Europe is expected to stabilize at above 90% of GDP. And then he says, well, serious empirical research has shown that at such high levels, public debt acts as a permanent drag on growth. If it is not reduced by introducing fiscal consolidation, it will become an ever heavier burden on our economies. Obviously, what he's referring to here is the Reinhardt and Rogoff study, which was published in 2010. Other policymakers also used results from this study to justify their calls for immediate fiscal consolidation. So what I did in the paper is to actually ask the question, well, what are the empirical foundations of this? Is there actually good empirical evidence that high public debt levels are a drag on economic growth? So first of all, I show you a funnel plot here with regard to the estimates that you find on the linear effects of higher public debt levels on growth. I will talk about potential thresholds on non-linear effects afterwards. So a funnel plot as before, you have on the horizontal axis a standardized coefficient to make estimates from different studies comparable. In total, I included about 550 estimates from 30 primary studies. And basically what I find is that indeed the unweighted average of the results reported in the literature point to negative association between higher public debt levels and economic growth. So that would imply that a 10 percentage points increase in public debt to GDP on average is associated with a decline in annual economic growth by about 0.14 percentage points, and that this is also significant. However, when you look at the funnel, again, precision on the vertical axis and the standardized effect sizes on the horizontal axis, you already see visually that it is very asymmetric. So there are many more estimates which are rather imprecise on the left at the bottom, on the left to the 0 vertical effect line. There are missing estimates somewhere around here, which is an indication that there is likely to be publication selection bias in favor of negative growth effects of higher public debt levels. But do we actually find that when we conduct funnel asymmetry tests? So here in this table, the first column just shows you the unweighted average, which I already explained to you. And in the second column, I conduct the funnel asymmetry test, which is when you regress the standardized coefficients here on the vertical axis on their standard errors. The assumption is that if the funnel plot were symmetric, you would not expect to find a systematic and significant coefficient. But actually, we do find a highly significant coefficient with a negative sign, which suggests that there is actually publication bias. The funnel is indeed asymmetric. So there seems to be publication bias in favor of reporting negative linear growth effects of higher public debt levels. There's an over-reporting of these results in the literature. And when you correct for that, that is the beta 0 parameter coefficient. When you correct for that, you can no longer reject the hypothesis that on average, the linear effect of higher public debt and growth is 0. You conduct all kinds of robustness checks with regard to that. I will not talk about it now, but this consistently leads you to the conclusion that there is very likely severe publication bias, which influences this literature. Now, the next step then is to ask the question, well, what other factors may contribute to explaining why different studies report partly contradictory results beyond publication bias? So this is simply about finding an econometric model where you have as a dependent variable, again, the standardized coefficients that you want to explain. On the right-hand side, you again have the standard error, which allows you to test for publication bias. And you now also include a set of additional control variables. What did I code for here? For example, the impact of higher public debt levels on growth may differ in advanced economies compared to developing countries. That is something you can code for you. So you code a dummy variable, which looks at the underlying data sample, whether it's advanced countries only, whether it's developing countries only, or whether it's a mix of countries. You can also check for different characteristics when it comes to study design and econometric details. So one of the things I checked for, which will turn out to be important, is whether papers actually use an instrumental variable approach to tackle potential endogeneity issues between public debt and growth. Well, it could well be that it's actually third factors that are driving both changes in public debt to GDP and economic growth. Quite likely, actually, right? So think about banking crises, for example. So I code for whether papers actually tackle the endogeneity issue. I also code for whether the estimate is about a long-run effect of higher public debt levels on growth, or whether it's about a short-run effect. And you can also consider different publication characteristics. For example, whether papers that were published in journals with lower or higher impact factors, whether they report different results. You can also, for example, collect citations, which will also turn out to be significant in the regressions, to check whether actually papers that report specific results, whether they receive more or less citations. So in the regressions that I will show to you, I use weighted least squares. So an important choice in meta-analysis is always which kind of weights to use. The idea is that the estimates should not all receive the same weight, because some of them might be more reliable than others. And typically what you do is you use precision weights. So estimates that are more precise are typically also more reliable, and therefore they receive more weight than estimates that are less precise. That is the standard choice, because actually Monte Carlo simulations And several econometric papers have shown that this should be the preferred estimator, but typically you also use other estimators to then check whether results are consistent. Then I will show you results using this weighted least squares estimator. So I won't bore you with regression tables very much. Just very quickly, in the first column, the baseline specification here in this model. What does it tell us actually? So I regress now the standardized coefficients on the linear effects of higher public debt levels on growth. I regress them on various control variables in different bound specifications. Actually, what I find is here the constant interpretation here is that for our reference specification, which is for advanced countries, we indeed find that once we control for other confounding factors, we can no longer reject that the average linear effect of higher public debt on growth is 0. We still find evidence for publication bias, even if we control for other variables, which is very much supportive of our prior conclusion. Interestingly, I do not find systematic differences between the effects in advanced countries compared to developing countries. But what I do find is the tackling endogeneity matters. And that is also, I think, kind of intuitive. So papers that do consider that third factors may actually influence both growth and public debt to GDP, they report less adverse growth effects of higher public debt levels. I also find that papers published in journals with higher journal impact factors, they tend to report less adverse growth effects of higher public debt levels. And what's also interesting, however, papers that report negative growth effects of higher public debt, they tend to receive many more citations. Okay, now I was just talking about linear effects of higher public debt and growth. Obviously, many of the arguments are actually about non-linearities or potential thresholds in the public debt to GDP ratio beyond which growth may slow. That's the Reinhardt and Rogoff story, basically. So I also collected in a separate database estimates on thresholds based on various endogenous panel threshold models. And here I again show a funnel plot to you. So you have on the horizontal axis, you have the threshold in the public debt to GDP ratio beyond which the papers estimate that growth slows down. And on the vertical axis, you again have the precision. I need to mention here that there are also several papers who do not find significant thresholds, and they are not even covered here. So I only show you basically a selection of papers that claim to find a significant threshold. But the point here is that when you look at this, the threshold estimates are all over the place, right? So they do not agree at all. Some find thresholds at 90%, so the Reinhardt and Rogoff story or beyond, but many actually find much lower thresholds. And even the most precise estimates, which are at the top, do not agree at all. What that suggests, and I confirm that with a meta-regression analysis in the paper, is that data and specification choices have an outsized influence on the threshold estimates, which are reported in the literature. So they are very sensitive to small changes in data and specification. So they are really not reliable at all. So the main conclusion from this is there is actually no good evidence of a uniform threshold in the public debt to GDP ratio beyond which growth may slow, which obviously also would imply in policy terms that one would need to be very cautious with one-size-fits-all fiscal policy prescriptions in terms of what countries should do if they face higher public debt levels. So actually, the empirical foundations for this very simple story that has been used by policymakers is very, very shaky. Let me move to another paper which has been quite prominent. Jorge told me that he also used this paper already in different contexts when he was in touch with people in ministries and policymakers. It's on the question, does fiscal policy help stabilize the economy? So it's basically on the size of the fiscal multiplier. This is not a paper of mine. It's a paper written by Sebastian Gechert and Ansgar Rannenberg, published in 2018 in the Journal of Economic Surveys. So again, I show you their funnel plot here. So what this shows you is on the horizontal axis, the fiscal multipliers. So you can see that in total they have 100 primary studies, about 100 primary studies, and about 2,000 multiplier estimates. You see that there are indeed papers who report even negative fiscal multipliers. There are papers that report multipliers close to 0. But you can also see that the more precise estimates are typically significantly higher. And what's important here, they distinguish between different economic regimes, because their paper is actually about whether fiscal multipliers in upswings are higher or lower than during downswings. So the green dots here are for a downswing or recession regime, and the blue dots here are for what they call an average regime. So if papers actually do not distinguish between upswing or downswing regimes, if there is only one regime. And the other dots, which are here in red, and there are only few of them, they are for an upswing or boom regime. And the main finding is actually that fiscal multipliers on average are close to 1, but they are significantly higher than 1 during economic downswings. They find that multipliers also differ across spending categories. So here you see that actually public investment multipliers are highest. You can see that basically for all spending categories that they cover, fiscal multipliers are higher during downswings than in normal times or during upswings. But you can see that public investment multipliers are higher than, for example, the transfer multipliers. And another important finding in the paper is that actually tax multipliers are typically significantly smaller than 1, and they are also less regime dependent. So they vary less over the business cycle than spending multipliers. So that is their main regression table. So they also conducted a meta-regression analysis. Basically, they want to explain variation in the fiscal multiplier estimates they collected from the literature. And I will just mention 2 interesting results they came up with. Well, first of all, at the top, you see what I already told you, which is that on average, fiscal multipliers are close to 1, but they are significantly higher during economic downswings. That's the RLO coefficient here. So fiscal multipliers on average during downswings, according to their estimations, are about 1.7, 1.8. But they do find that the models that are used to estimate the multipliers, they have an influence on the fiscal multipliers that are reported, which is also kind of intuitive. I mean, everyone who has done multiplier estimations on his or her own can probably also understand this. The way you identify the fiscal shocks, whether you do that with a narrative approach, with a VAR, or whatever, that can actually influence the multiplier estimates that the papers come up with. They also find that, which is intuitive, peak multipliers in the cycle, they are higher than cumulative multipliers. So they have a couple of interesting papers and point to some determining factors that allow you to explain quite a lot of variation in the multipliers that are reported. So let me move to the last area that I want to cover, or where I want to apply some meta-analysis tools, which is on the question whether employment protection increases unemployment. Also an important policy debate. I mean, if you think back, especially to the 1990s and early 2000s, you had the OECD, the IMF, the European Commission relentlessly arguing that rigid labor market institutions are a key source of higher unemployment rates, and that in particular, high employment protection is the source of unemployment. And you still find, I mean, also during the Euro crisis, recommendations of basically reducing employment protection to spur job creation and bring down unemployment. The question is, what are the empirical foundations of this? I conducted a meta-analysis which was published last year in Oxford Economic Papers, where I tried to collect all the available estimates from the literature. It's about 900 estimates in total from about 80 papers or 75 papers. And here again, I show you the funnel plot, so the distribution of the results. So the vertical axis, the precision of these estimates, estimates with higher precision at the top, with lower precision at the bottom, and the standardized coefficient to make estimates comparable across studies on the horizontal axis. And when you look at this, you can see that I used a color code. So kind of the lighter dots here are based on using the OECD's Employment Protection Legislation Index to estimate the impact of employment protection on unemployment. Whereas the darker dots, which you mostly see on the right to the of the vertical zero effect line, they are based on using survey-based employment protection legislation indices to estimate the impact of employment protection on unemployment. And what you can also already see graphically is that it seems that estimates based on survey-based EPL variables report systematically different results. They tend much more, they lean more towards reporting unemployment increasing effects of employment protection legislation. Whereas the other estimates are also distributed rather symmetrically, and you also find several papers which actually report that high employment protection contributes to lowering unemployment. So I also conducted the tests that I have shown to you before, applied them to this literature, and actually what I find is mild publication bias in favor of unemployment increasing effects of employment protection. Once you correct for that, the unemployment effects are negligible. However, in my best practice models, actually you can make a good case that on average, higher employment protection actually is related to somewhat lower unemployment. But what's the most important finding, and that is also supported in the meta-regressions here, is that how you actually quantify employment protection is crucial. And many of the papers that are cherry-picked in policy reports to justify the calls for deregulate labor markets, reduce employment protection to reduce unemployment, they actually cite exactly these papers. What they do is basically they ask managers and experts about their views on hiring and firing regulations and how strict employment protection actually is. Actually, you can make a good case that these indices of employment protection based on surveys are problematic in themselves because it could, for example, be that the opinions or expert views of managers and others on hiring and firing regulations are dependent on where you are in the business cycle. So it could be that they are more pessimistic when unemployment is going up and less pessimistic when unemployment is going down, which arguably explains, at least to some extent, why these survey-based variables, when you plug them into econometric models, they tend to support this conventional view that employment protection legislation is bad for unemployment, why they tend to support it more than other employment protection legislation indices, which are based on using legal provisions, where you look at notice periods and severance payments, and then construct an index from that. But overall, also here you find that meta-analysis leads you to the conclusion that calls for reducing employment protection to lower unemployment are basically unfounded if you look at the body of empirical literature as a whole. So let me conclude. So I think meta-analysis is useful because it often allows you to contest conventional views, particularly when it comes to mainstream macro policy descriptions. Many of what is deemed to be facts in the policy debates that we are having is actually biased. Selective reporting plays a role there. And what you actually often see is cherry picking of specific empirical results which do not hold up if you look at the empirical literature as a whole. And this publication bias is typically strongest where there is no theory competition or where theory competition is very low. Yeah, think again about this literature concerning the employment effects of minimum wages. Then you have a very clear and dominant prediction based on neoclassical labor market theory, which gives a particular strong incentive to researchers and editors to prefer estimates that actually conform to this theory. And as I showed you, one prominent meta-analysis actually finds that there is severe publication bias. And to some extent, this has also featured in policy debates in various countries, because it obviously kind of raises some doubts with regard to the strong predictions that we often hear. Meta-analysis can also contribute to establishing new consensus and influence, at least to some extent, policy debates. I mean, I also talked about this fiscal multiplier paper, which these days is now also cited in INF papers and papers of other international organizations when it comes to summarizing what we know about fiscal multipliers. But there are still lots of opportunities for applying meta regression tools, meta-analysis to other bodies of empirical literature. So together with some colleagues, we are now working on the macro effects of interest rate hikes versus interest rate cuts. But you could also think of other quantifiable parameters that are interesting for macro policy debates, such as whether fiscal policy is pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical. But you could potentially also apply that to some of the prominent debates that we are having in heterodox economics. For example, I think there are many empirical estimates on whether growth is profit-led or wage-led, but I'm not aware of any systematic attempt at when it comes to synthesizing this body of literature. So I'm at the end, but I briefly want to mention a list of selected meta-analysis papers that have been published over recent years and that you might be interested in looking at. First, a paper on inflation targeting, which actually shows that inflation targeting has been much less beneficial than is often suggested. A paper on the macro effects of quantitative easing, which compares the research findings of economists working at central bank research departments with economists at universities, and which finds that the academics report much more pessimistic estimates of the macro effects of QE than the central bankers, which is not very surprising, right? But there is one exception, and the exception is the German Bundesbank, which is even less pessimistic in terms of the QE effects on inflation and output than our academic studies. Then there is a paper by Sebastian Geckert and co-authors. It's on the substitutional elasticity between capital and labor. It used to be called Death to the Douglas production function, this paper. They had to change the paper title because the editors didn't want it to be that controversial. But actually what they show is that the capital labor elasticity of substitution is much lower than often claimed. And this is basically inconsistent, in particular with the Douglas production function. And also a recent paper by Sebastian Geckert and myself, which is on whether corporate tax cuts boost economic growth, where we find not so much. Actually, after you correct for publication bias. So you can see that meta-analysis is also becoming more accepted in economics, and more research groups are taking a meta-analysis up or trying to apply the toolbox. Other disciplines outside of economics, they already started to do so several decades ago. So economics is relatively slow in catching up, but there is now also some research activity in this regard. And the last thing I want to mention, many of the things that I said today and where I may have been too quick for you to capture all the details, you can actually nicely read all that in a recent paper published by Sebastian Gechert in Industrial and Corporate Change. I think it was published just 2 months ago, which is on, well, basically explaining the approach of meta-analysis, in particular for macroeconomists, and also nicely summarizing the evidence that we have based on different meta-analyses. So many thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward to all the questions that you may have and to the
Thank you very much, Philipp, for your talk, presenting this tool for us and its application for 3 topics that I'm sure are very interesting for all of us. Vamos ahora a abrir el turno de preguntas. Yo paso el micrófono para...
Thank you, Philipp, for the presentation. I have 2 questions. First, I do agree with you that meta-analysis may be very useful to report publication bias, but I'm less convinced about how to interpret the average coefficients that you get. Because I think, do you think that they have causal interpretation? Because I guess that in macro, most of these papers that you do here do not try to identify a causal relationship. That's one. And then the second one is, what's your opinion about the strategy that some journals are having right now? Namely, that they are accepting papers before results are obtained. For example, in development economics, they're doing this kind of thing.
But that's more with the randomized control trials, I guess, or with experiments, right? This is about, well, basically this debate that you could also kind of game the experience or your research design when you actually find that the experiments do not bring the results that you would expect or that you like. So that's why there's now a pre-registry with many journals where you kind of pre-register your experiments and you tell or you enter in the database what your experimental design will be, so that afterwards there is a documentation which shows that you did not change the research design. I mean, I think there are also bad sides to this very heavy focus on experiments and randomized control trials, and there are ethical concerns. For example, it very much restricts also the policy questions that you can actually pursue in order for you to be able to publish a paper, at least in the mainstream journals. But it's now the gold standard, and I guess that, I mean, there are papers challenging this gold standard, and I think that's also important. But if you are going for these experiments, it makes sense to have something like a pre-registry, I think. There's, for example, also a recent paper, even published in the American Economic Review, which shows that actually, and that kind of also speaks in parts to your first question, that many of the papers that use or allegedly use causal designs when it comes to estimating effect sizes, they are also biased. And the results published in the top 5 journals, and there is the bias in economics, as we all know, they are not better or not less biased than the results published in other papers. I think these are extremely important papers to have, because it kind of also challenges this notion that what is published in the top journals is just, higher quality, higher standards, and so on. So from this perspective, it is good to see also research efforts in this direction. There are also papers, for example, which show that if you look at the findings published in the top 5 journals on different questions, then there's also strong evidence for selective reporting or choosing model specifications with statistically significant findings. There's a paper which is called Star Wars, the Empirics Strike Back. It's a very nice paper title, actually one of my favorite paper titles. And they collected thousands of estimates from the Quarterly Journal of Economics and the American Economic Review. And they show that basically test results which are not significant are very much underreported, which they interpret in the sense that, well, as I told you, there are lots of degrees of freedom and there are incentives to choose model specifications that turn out to be significant at conventional confidence levels. How to interpret the average coefficients was your question. What I showed you is basically the so-called funnel asymmetry precision effect test. So you regress the standardized coefficients on the standard errors. Then you look at the coefficient estimate for the standard error. You check whether it's negative, positive, significant or not, which will be evidence for whether the funnel plot is symmetric or asymmetric. But then actually econometric studies and Monte Carlo simulations have shown that the constant that you obtain from running these regressions is actually a nice Taylor approximation of the true underlying effect size after correcting for publication bias. It's an approximation. Obviously, that always needs to be stressed. We don't know the true effect, also in conducting meta-analysis, and this is also not a perfect toolbox. There are also caveats and pitfalls there. So I'm not confident, in saying that I'm 100% sure that the average linear growth effect of higher public debt is 0. And I mean, there is also variance. It doesn't mean that this is the case for each and every country. But what I'm very confident in is that the interpretations that are taken in the most cited papers published very prominently, that they are basically, they do not hold up when you conduct this kind of analysis. I mean, what you can also do in meta-analysis, if you want to be more confident about causal interpretations, is you can look at subsamples of the estimates that you collect. Yeah? For example, if you think that a particular way of addressing endogeneity issues to have more of a causal interpretation, that this is a good approach, then you can look at the subsample and check how the distribution of results looks when you actually restrict the sample. So my message here is not, that I'm totally confident that meta-analysis is the approach to have a very precise estimate of the true underlying effect, but I think it moves you much better into the direction of the true effect. And I think it's very likely in macro that the empirical evidence we have points to much smaller effects in many instances than some of the prominent studies suggest, which are often, biased because it's, just very nice to publish potentially surprising result, which is strong, editors like to publish something like that, and that is then also something that sticks with all the successor papers or is kind of a benchmark. But when you use meta-analysis, not in all cases, but in many cases, you find that at least the weighted average or the average standardized coefficient is significantly smaller. And in that, I'm pretty confident when I apply these tools.
Is the meta-analysis able to show the quality of the theories? Is better than the other? For instance, if you have two models based on completely different theories and they get the same result, what is your conclusion?
That's quite likely. There are other choices researchers take which yield similar results. And with meta-regression, you have a good chance at actually detecting these other determining factors. I mean, this is a toolbox to look at or to quantitatively synthesize empirical research findings. But these empirical research findings are often informed or motivated by theory. And the point that I wanted to make is that, given that mainstream economics has been also performing the gatekeeper function, thereby reducing theory competition in terms of what can actually be published, in some areas, this is particularly stark, or the theoretical predictions of neoclassical economics are particularly strong. And that's where you typically also find that publication bias is very prominent and is very substantial and is much larger than in research fields where you actually do have more of theory competition. And where you also, when you look at the empirical papers, where you also find that they motivate what they are doing with different theoretical arguments. So I talked about this paper on employment effects of minimum wages, but I also, for example, have a recent meta-analysis on the output effects of economic globalization. And I mean, that is kind of also one of the bedrocks, right? That globalization is good for growth. And when you look at the empirical literature, I mean, although there are also other models who come up with more nuanced conclusions, most of the empirical work is informed and motivated by this dominant prediction that trade globalization, but also financial globalization is good for growth. And so it's kind of no surprise that you also find strong evidence for selective reporting. I mean, I think in some cases, incentives really do matter a lot when it comes to research. I mean, you have to think about it from that perspective. For a researcher, unfortunately, the question is often, what can be published? Publish or perish, it is at many universities, if you want to make a career these days. But from a social welfare perspective, the question would actually be very different. The question would be, well, the results that you obtain in your addition to the literature or in your contribution to the existing literature, how does that contribute to our understanding, and how does it contribute to scientific advancement? And the incentives there are often not aligned, and even well-meaning researchers often take the understandable, easy route. I mean, I'm sure that many of you have conducted empirical research. I'm doing it regularly, and I mean, we all know that we can game our model specifications to come up with results that we like more than what we may actually get when we look at the wider range of specification or specifications that are not our preferred ones. And I think that's where meta-analysis is particularly useful, because it kind of allows us to cut through the morass, you know. And as I said, there's also a lot of econometric theory work behind that. New methods of detecting publication bias are being invented. And obviously, if you want to be very confident in the conclusions that you draw from your meta-analysis, what you should do is you should also use different methods and then check whether you arrive at similar results. But my impression is that basically, last year I was in Athens. It was a meta-analysis conference. And these days, you know, the audience was similar to here. It was about 50 or 60 researchers. Tom Stanley is one of the professors who really pushed meta-analysis into economics. And he told me that when he started doing that in the late 80s, early 90s, no one wanted to listen. And they were all like, well, the psychologists might be doing that, other fields might be doing it. We don't need that. And it was also basically impossible to publish papers based on using this toolbox. This has slowly changed, and it's now a little bit more accepted. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that this is a substitute for good theoretical work, not at all. But I think it's a very useful toolbox to have a very critical look at the empirical foundations of many of the alleged facts that we use all of the time. And there it is extremely useful. And I think it's good to see that acceptance has improved, and that I'm also aware of some open-minded researchers in other fields, also people who might be familiar with some post-Keynesian economics, but who would not identify themselves strongly with heterodox economics, but who are also kind of open when it comes to looking at papers like the ones that I presented to you today. And in addition, I think that the results that you obtain are also useful when you want to engage in policy debates. I mean, I mentioned it, Jorge is referring regularly to this fiscal multiplier paper, because it's basically something where it's much more difficult for mainstream economists to say with confidence, but that's my favorite cherry-picked multiplier estimate or result. I know that fiscal multipliers are close to zero in this or that circumstance. I mean, the weight of evidence is pretty substantial already in some empirical literatures, just because empirical economics has grown over recent decades, and so you have hundreds, if not thousands, of estimates on some of the interesting research questions, and that is something you can exploit. And I think we should do that. And so that's why I said, arguably, what I was trying to do here is obviously not a substitute for working on theory. But what you could do, the last thing I would say with regard to your comment or question, you could also, for example, code in the meta-regression analysis for the kind of theoretical framework which papers use. You could code information on that and then check whether that actually has an impact on the results these papers report. So you can also be rather creative, and different strands of literature may actually point to different important study dimensions.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
my question is about the selection of estimates, because I think, as you said, that there is a lot of degrees of freedom in the selection of estimates. So how can you deal with that problem? It comes to my mind, I'm not progressing, not only progressing, but I'm continuing this process until the end. So that's the question.
Okay, thanks for your good question. Actually, I would argue there are not that many degrees of freedom in selecting the estimates that you include in the meta-analytical database, if you are really transparent. I mean, these days, if you want to publish a meta-analysis, you basically have to conform to the guidelines of the Meta-Analysis Society in economics. So they basically tell you what you need to do to make it possible for other researchers to replicate what you did in your meta-analysis. And that means that you have to be clear in terms of what kind of keyword searches you used and what kind of other criteria you used. And so it's not really possible. Typically, the reviewers are also quite keen at looking at whether you actually did what you said you're doing, to check whether your selection of estimates is as comprehensive as possible. I mean, obviously, it could still be that you're missing some estimates, or that you fail to detect a primary study that might also be relevant because it has a different paper title than most of the others. It's not being cited by the other papers, and so on. And from time to time, that may be the case. But anyways, I mean, if you have a data set with 800 observations or even 3,000 observations, it typically doesn't make a big difference whether you have these 10 extra estimates or not. But I mean, it's certainly an important question that you raise, and my answer would be that you also need to have high standards when it comes to making the meta-analytical data set and your code available to other researchers, which you have to do with many of the journals where you can actually publish this. For example, the Journal of Economic Surveys has one associate editor who is in charge of handling submissions of meta-analysis papers, and he makes sure that you're really sticking to these guidelines. I mean, nothing is perfect, but I think there are fewer degrees of freedom than in most of the single estimate kilometric works.
Thank you very much for the presentation. First of all, I would like to say that I really appreciate the value of the methodology. I think that it's very helpful for all to identify this publication by us in favor of classical thought, in favor of the liberal thought, justify all these policies. So this is a very important point that I want to highlight. But putting aside this objective, that, as I have mentioned, is very important, my concern has to do with more methodological or even epistemological, and it has to do with the lack of context. Yeah, when you study, for example, a country, time series analysis, you have a cultural context, historical, political, sociological context that is going to be very helpful for you to interpret the results. This is something that somehow you lose when you perform or carry out a data. But in this case, this type of analysis is going beyond, because you are assuming that the object of your analysis is not a country, is not a company, is studies. So my concern has to do with this lack of context. And before, when we are economists, we are social scientists. And this qualitative analysis is worried about the existence of universal laws. So my question, my concrete question is, this lack of context can be an important limitation of this methodology when we are working and studying economy.
So thanks for your great question and also for being a little bit challenging and provocative. But first of all, let me say that I share your general concern, but I would say that this applies actually to large parts of the econometric work that you find out there. So it's not a particular challenge for meta-analysis. But it is important, and one thing you can do in meta-analysis to arguably bring in at least some context is that, for example, in some strands of empirical research, you have estimates for specific countries, various countries, and different estimates over time, different data sets, and so on. And so you can kind of zoom in as much as the data allows you to do. In some parts of the empirical research, it is possible. Not in all bodies of literature, however. But actually, when you look at many of, for example, my meta-analysis papers, in my conclusion, in terms of what you can draw or what you can take away from the meta-analysis results, is often a call for more context in the quantitative work. Actually, looking at, for example, when it comes to the impact of public debt on growth, looking at specific time periods in specific countries, taking into account exactly what you referred to, which is the institutional context, the macroeconomic circumstances, and so on. Because we all know that basically with the econometric tools that we have, it is often very difficult to bring that in. So to some extent, meta-analysis is also suffering from similar problems as other econometric work. I take that criticism. I still think it's useful because it's basically a way to double check the work that is already out there and that is having an influence also in policy debates. But I totally agree that we also need qualitative but also quantitative work which does a better job in tackling the context in which certain policies have an effect on macroeconomic outcomes. You can do some things with meta-analysis, arguably, yeah, but it's not the best tool to take that into account. And I take your methodological criticism. So in parts, I can share it, but as I said, I still think that applying this toolbox can be useful.
Philipp, let me echo the thanks that others have said. It's an impressive research approach. And we're always looking for ways to level the playing field for competing ideas. And this is really an incredibly exciting way. So often good arguments will bust because we're just not interested in it. We're just not interested. We already have the argument. And this cuts through it. One thought that came to my mind is, has anyone been focusing on meta-analysis through time? So like take something like Sebastian Geckert's multiplier study. Could one break it down by decades and sort of show how multiplier assessments may have time changed over time? And also what would then be interesting, within those decades, whether the meta-analysis reveals periods of more bias or less bias.
Yeah. So excellent question. Thanks for your comments, Tom. I also think this is an important point. How do effects of how does the impact of economic policy vary over time. So at the moment, I'm working together with Sebastian Gechert on a project on the macro effects of conventional monetary policy, where we want to do exactly what you are pushing for, which is to, for example, look at whether monetary policy in the US in the 70s and 80s had different effects on output, employment, and inflation than in other time periods. But also if you compare it, for example, to other large economic blocks. The existing meta-analysis papers typically also look at the time dimension in various ways. I have not stressed it today, but typically what you do is you check whether the estimates vary with publication year, which is at least a proxy for the availability of data. So you can see whether the estimates are trending. And some papers actually find that bias is going up or going down. What you can also do is you can look at the mean year of the underlying data, which is also a way of checking what kind of data sample was actually used, and then check whether that is systematically related to the results that are being reported. And there are several instances where there is clear evidence of such a cyclicality in the results that are reported. For example, I don't know whether there is, I don't remember whether there's something in the fiscal multiplier paper actually, but in several cases you find that actually when an empirical literature has just been started, is not in its boom phase, then publication bias might be particularly severe. Whereas typically as the literature grows and more people contribute to it, there is more double checking and triple checking, which in many instances also helps in terms of reducing the bias. Not in all cases, but in many cases. But we are also now thinking hard about whether we can do more with regard to that, because I think that's also particularly important when it comes to policy conclusions, right? So there might be structural breaks also. You talked about that also today in the morning. Financialization and other phenomena that may actually lead you to the theoretical expectations that there could be breaks. So new time periods where you would expect monetary policy to be more effective or less effective, for example. So with this new project, we're trying to do that. I'm currently also working on a paper on the cyclicality of fiscal policy, where I'm also specifically checking for the time period. But it is something that you can address if you do it carefully. In many cases, it is possible to collect this information and then try to find whether the time dimension actually plays a role.
No hay más preguntas. Thank you, Phil, for your inspiring talk. Y gracias a todos y todas por la participación en la sesión. Lo dejamos aquí y es a las 6 para la siguiente sesiones paralelas también en la pantalla.
Thank you. If you want to look at this chart for just like also send you papers I think you would access